Dael is the EMEA CTO for Databricks. He's also one of the most insightful and entertaining people I have encountered in these sessions, offering a world of value in terms of seeing what's currently happening with technology and the really interesting bits that are at play around the data space, AI, and engineering your business for the future. With that, I might sound a bit like a fanboy. I obviously am. So Dael, I'll be hanging on every word. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, and really looking forward to hearing your session.
Awesome, and great to be back. So quick housekeeping. Am I visible to everybody? Am I live?
You
awesome.
are.
Okay.
And
so
for our audience, sorry, I just want to drop in quickly just to go. Dael's here to actually present on this. He will take questions at the end. You should see a Q&A function at the top of the screen where you can log any questions that you have. I will moderate those and bring those back to Dael, but I'm sure that you, like me, will probably gain all the answers you need from Dael, even without having to ask a question. But if you do, please use that Q&A function. Sorry, Dael, back to you.
No worries, no worries. And we're using this very cool little view where I'm superimposed above my my talk. So I see I can do kind of cool stuff where I can move myself around. So I might have to play around with that little toggle. And what's the size thing? Oh, I can make myself smaller and bigger. Okay, cool. Well, good. Good to know I've got these little cool tools. I'm going to do a little talk today. So the last time I spoke, it was on this really bizarre thing that we were sort of seeing in the business intelligence space, and something I called the missing middle. I actually went on to do that talk about 43 times across Europe, and I did it at Gartner, even at the big Gartner conference. This is a new piece, and it's a very interesting take on what I've witnessed over the last sort of 6 months or so, and actually even further than that. So just for context, I work in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I travel quite a fair bit. I work with a lot of our strategic customers. Databricks has obviously sort of hit very strong center stage in the last year. We got strong leadership positions in lots of different quadrants, and we have done some remarkable things in the sort of AI race, and very, very sort of well-rounded set of capabilities. My talk today is on expertise exchanges and ecosystems, and I want to kind of dig into this a little bit. Like, we have this notion of AI-driven companies, and one of the things I want to almost get to is the topic of interoperability, which often is thrown around and not really well understood. And part of this is because of some recent acquisitions that we've made, but also part of it is instinctually part of the DNA of our company. So let me jump into what triggered the whole thinking. So our Boston Consulting Group, and I'm not taking credit for this work. If I move to the other side here, you can kind of see I've sourced them. They did some work around future-ready companies, and our GM for EMEA put this slide up to kind of talk through at an executive forum what different companies are doing. If you kind of double click on some of these things, there's a maturity curve that sort of runs alongside where you have the discovering side over here, and then you've got like building companies, scaling companies, and AI-driven companies. And as you can see, 37%, 35%, 16%, 16%. So there's not a lot of companies that are fundamentally AI-driven. And I think the numbers are a bit skewed because I don't know how they did the maths. They also did a whole lot of really interesting things around showcasing how different numbers can play a role and how there's this 1.55x sort of multiplier that pulls apart on the S&P. So that's how you outperform the S&P. So this is kind of interesting stuff, right? Anyway, why is this important? Well, I was at a conference recently, and this guy, Jensen, made a statement on stage with our CEO, Ali Godsi. And they were on stage together, and Jensen said, "We are the biggest small company in the world." And I found that quite remarkable. So I sort of thought, let me dig into that a little bit, right? And there was a lot of conversation on that. And one of the things that I noticed is they're a 3 trillion market cap company, obviously a bit of normalizing with the markets moving around lately. But they only have 26,000 people and they're very asset light. Okay. And so these are 3 very interesting signals. So high value, low headcount, asset light, and they're very good at chip design. So one of the things Jensen talked about is how AI is injected into different parts of the company. So there are things that they do. They do chip design, which I've mentioned. They use AI for bug database management, or and that would be kind of synthesizing through bugs and figuring out like how to solve them. They do a lot of things like product and service development, the supply chain optimization, weather prediction, because weather has a material impact on chip manufacturing. Customer service, obviously a huge area where AI has made a huge impact, and AI factories, this idea, and then sort of energy efficiency. Like obviously this is a big topic, and I'll talk a little bit about this. I thought this was kind of cool, right? So I thought, oh, okay, how does this actually, how would this actually materialize? So I started to dig into the key challenges. And one of the things that I sort of fundamentally know from my career in the industry is that simply friction and waste are major resistance factors to being able to achieve this. So I'm going to throw a little biochemistry at you. Do you know we have 2.4 million red blood cells that are produced every minute, and they have an average lifespan of 120 days. So these are new cells that are developed every minute. Every cell has a human genome of 3.2 billion nucleotides, which are replicated and checked 2.4 million times a minute. Okay, that's insane. That is like ridiculous precision. And that happens every day inside every single one of us. And we then start to think about how we copy data around and how we do synthesizing of information and information management and all of these kind of concepts that people work in every day. And what that tells me is we're grossly inefficient. As humans, we're incredibly efficient. As companies, we're grossly inefficient. So I started digging into sort of some of the thesis behind this, some of the thinking. There's this really awesome guy who won a Nobel Prize many years ago named Ronald Coase. And Ronald, you know, he sort of hypothesized a question. He said, why do we have firms? You know, why do we have these big companies? Why do companies grow? And we have markets. Why can't we just use markets for anything? And there's sort of 5 main points that he kind of articulated in this work. And it's very interesting work because I like going to the genesis of stuff. And companies effectively reduce costs. So they reduce the transaction cost because of contracts and because of, you know, ways in which that sort of layering effect can make things more efficient intrinsically than they are extrinsically by doing business on the market. And this led to this balancing act that we often have in tech, which is, do I build it? Do I buy it? And it's not quite as binary as that, but, you know, that's sort of how it plays. But what's fascinating about the research is that, you know, company size limits is a factor and managers versus markets are a factor. And these are 2 really interesting factors that I sort of dug into. Now, if you start to then look at companies today, I didn't know this was a thing, and I actually went and found this. So the zombie companies are an actual thing. So they're companies with high debt, and they can only just service their debt. They basically cannot reduce the principal of debt, and what ultimately happens is they undermine economic recovery. So they're basically like they're just fundamentally kind of there. And they don't really create economic value. They don't really, and they often need bailouts, and they often need, you know, they sort of challenge. And tech is no different. So I'll get to that in a second. Another very interesting thing is that we have this kind of cost of managers in the middle, like the pace of things. 1937, things moved at a regular pace. I think things have just got completely out of hand. And that has become a very interesting thing. And middle management is an impactful human in the organization. How can they play a more impactful role? Because right now they're sort of playing the shuttling along, and there's a lot of meetings involved in this process. The other thing I kind of started to dig into is the idea of context. Now, being a a CTO that flies around, Europe, Middle East, and Africa, I come across lots of cultures. And one of my coaches once gave me a book that was written by an INSEAD professor, Aaron Mayer. And it's about kind of these cultural misunderstandings that take place. And it's a hilarious book. So actually, anyone who's really bored and wants something humorous that will and are in international roles, this is one of the best things. And there's like things like high context, low context cultures, and how sometimes people are principle first versus application first, and how sometimes in companies you have a hierarchical sort of alignment versus egalitarian alignment. And it's really, really fascinating. But it really articulates how things play out. I've done talks on this in the past that, often large organizations are like navigating Game of Thrones, and there's a huge amount of fascinating things that play a role here. So you can't not count the politics of companies. You also have to look at these mismatches. So this was the sort of summary of the last talk that I gave. It was very much this missing middle, the many missing middles, and these intelligence gaps that we have in the business processes, and these organizational and data silos that tend to transpire. If we then look at some of the waste, CIOs can spend up to, let me make myself smaller, can spend up to about 20% of their annual budget maintaining code. That's humongous, and like that's a radical thing. And about 90% of enterprises still share data using email spreadsheets and secure FTP. Some even don't use secure FTP, they just use FTP. So this led me to this kind of underlying, how are we evaluating the customers that we have? And the key principle for AI-driven leads us to this notion of interoperability. We also have changed the way in which we engage. So one of the things that AI has done for us has made life very interesting, because it shifts us from requirements to questions. So let's work on a kind of proposal here. So if you were an AI-driven business, what questions, prompts, would you ask your data? So would you ask, how should we balance growth and profitability? What metrics it takes to raise the next investment round? This happens a lot in companies that we work with. What is our right to exist over the next 5 years? This was something that Jermaine Ball wrote recently in a newsletter around zombie companies. And how will we drive incremental enterprise value in that time frame? These are super existential questions. How many of you can answer these questions about your company easily? Okay, and the emphasis is on the word easily. And how do we actually get to these answers easily? And I think this is where the biggest step change can happen. And if we principally start to think this way, I think companies can really start to think about their business differently. There's another thing that happened when I was at Gartner, where somebody turned around to me and said, my job is data and AI, but my mandate is the chief profitability officer. And the whole idea is getting my business fit. So for those of you that don't know, there's this kind of intersection. So performance is metrics that are top line and tends to be how we make money. Profitability sits in the intersection, and productivity is the reduction of input relative to output and maintaining a high degree of quality. So it's both effective and efficient. And you have to understand the underlying maths behind this. And it's a really fascinating way of looking at the role of data and AI in a company today, especially with some of the material value it can create. And obviously there's things like first principle thinking, which very much fundamentally is, if we were to do this from the beginning, how would that work? If we get back to physics, if we get back to maths, how would it work? Bias for action is a big mandate in our company, like get into that experimental mindset. And then obviously there's these two middle spaces around cognitive load and balance. So that's about distribution of work. So these are really fascinating things. Anyway, let's jump into these three areas. So I want to explore these three areas around how will we unbundle expertise, how will we streamline exchange, and how will we adapt our ecosystem. So if we focus on the first one and start to look at, can AI change the valuation of my company? Okay, because this is a question I get from almost every board I speak to. And that really fundamentally dips into how we unbundle our expertise. what are the key things that make us valuable? And it's interesting because it would lead you to a series of prompts or questions. What expertise do we have in our business? That's a kind of micro question. And then what is our value proposition of our business? That's a more macro question. And these are very fascinating. So I've grappled for a long time on how to actually talk about this section. And I started with something kind of cool because I've managed people around the world and I've worked with some incredibly interesting people. And one of the fascinating things that Simon Sinek said, and I was listening to a podcast on this, where he said really talented people are highly asymmetric. I thought that's interesting. That's a very, very fascinating phrase. Have you ever tried fitting someone into a role that you've defined beforehand? Imagine me, like I get this a lot when I'm interviewed, where people go, well, you're a CTO, but you're also a biochemist. And you also, did this and this and this and this. So people are bigger than the roles that they hold. And that's become like a sort of organizational thing that happens because there's value creation that happens because that person has more asymmetrical capabilities. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes they basically do the bare minimum. So there are those two states that exist with humans. Now, if you take that a step further, what it turns out that really valuable businesses are also highly asymmetric. Okay, so I said that, but I'm basing it on some really, really interesting work that a guy named Simon Torrance pulled together, which profiles the assets that are monetized in a company. So what do I mean by that? There's some fascinating assets that are monetized, and actually they lead to the value of a company, and so what those valuation multiples are, like how a company is valued, and also the margins that they're able to kind of create in terms of the money that they make. And if you look at the sort of the big players like the Amazons and the Microsofts, you could see how they're quite asymmetrical in the different capabilities and how they play games with the multipliers. There's obviously the 10x multiplier, which is the digital platforms, and that's part of the leading reason why a lot of the consultancies have been driving digital transformation for so long. There's also software, like software eating the world, as Mark Andreessen famously said, and that's a 5x multiplier. So those sort of things play a massive role. Biotech's in there, which is a very long cycle to innovate. But what you sort of see there is the traditional companies. So like automotive is massively physical. Financial services is a kind of spread between these two rafts. So you've got financial and human, and it's kind of split down the middle in an average financial services company. Ping An I threw in there because so Simon profiled Ping An. They're a massive company in China. They're ranked 16th on Forbes Global 2000 list and 33rd on Forbes Global 500. So they're a major organization, and what makes them quite different from your traditional financial services company is how they've managed to inch into software and digital platforms and fundamentally make themselves more valuable. Now, this is a means of understanding how value is far more asymmetrical. And actually, if you look at the difference between Amazon and Microsoft, you can fundamentally see how they are valuable, but also how they are different. And that's kind of a fascinating sort of thing. It's not that they bucketed into the Mag 7, but actually they're very different. We do a kind of piece around purpose, and I was looking for questions on how a company would evaluate like their breakdown of how the business runs. And this is a great piece that was put together, the business model canvas, many years ago, and it's like an HBR article. And there's a company that sort of have been doing this for almost a decade. But what I like about it is the questions. What I find fascinating is how hard these questions are to answer. And if you got a board of executives together, I can promise you some of these answers wouldn't come naturally to a lot of those people. And these are fundamentals. And what's fascinating about that is I was actually talking to an activist investor who's talking about breaking businesses down into fundamentals and do people actually understand how the fundamental business runs. So this is the very, very interesting clue of how things work. The other way is the depth of fundamentals. So we've got this, big layer of business that takes place, and it's actually not as simple as strategy straight into tech. There's a lot of building blocks. So I started to look and go, okay, well, how would I ask these questions in a company? Now, naturally, you would want to go to business intelligence, and you would want to go and say, in a business intelligence suite, I would be able to ask all these questions and get all these answers. And the truth is that that is not how business intelligence works today. So if we really get to the bottom of the truth here, we have a human who has skill. They look at dashboards and they look at reports. And at the bottom, data is squeezed to form information in the form of tables. And that ultimately leads to sort of sliced analytics cubes. This is a fundamentally narrow view of the world, and it likely results in about a 30% organizational productivity cost. And now what I mean by that is there's a lot of emails that cascade around to ask questions about the numbers on the dashboard. There's a lot of meetings that sort of are created. There's a lot of responses where there's context that's put together. Anyone on this call has probably been involved in a situation where they've had to produce a PowerPoint that explains a dashboard. And they have to do that every week. So that's a bit kind of nuts if you really think about it. So why is that? And that's because we have lots of data silos. We have asset silos, we have analytics silos, we have knowledge silos, we have content silos, we have reporting silos. All of these things are driven by the fact that we had limitations in tech, and those limitations, a lot of those limitations are gone. So we have to bring this data into a standardized approach. And I don't mean centralized, I mean standardized, which is, can we access this data in the same way using similar tools? And this is fundamentally what our company's been trying to do for a long time, and what a lot of companies are starting to realize in the tech space. And I'll get to a lot of how. But then you have to start to look at the capital data. So that really, really important meaty data, and this relational capital, physical capital, financial capital, intellectual capital, and human capital. How is that captured and where's that maintained? And what's fascinating about that is we start to move into where ERPs and SaaS have kind of captured a lot of the capital data. And that's a very, very interesting sort of space to look at. We also have to start to think about waste in form of these zombie companies. So how many companies or zombie companies in the software industry who are not making money, they're on sale for peanuts because, effectively there's been a lot of acquisitions taking place over the last year. Databricks ourselves have done about 13 acquisitions in the last sort of 18 months. These are not necessarily zombie companies. You have hyper talented people. So we call that an acqui-hire. We also have incredibly valuable technology. So like Mosaic and Tabular and Archeon have been incredibly valuable technologies that we've brought into our company. And it's often a combination of different things. Now, do you ever go through your service catalog as a company and look and go, am I holding on to a zombie? Do I have a zombie in my portfolio that of companies that I'm paying money to, but they have no future? And I'm one of the few that's keeping them alive. When we talk about data intelligence, we're looking at it differently. And this is the talk I did the last time, was the rise of generative BI and ultimately what we're now calling AI BI. And in this, we start to look at like this person, the actor, and the skills they have to understand context and semantics. And this data intelligence platform that Databricks has built will look at insights, which we call compound AI. And that basically is inferred from information, knowledge, and models. Now, you'll notice I put knowledge and models down at the bottom, and I've put context and semantics up at the top. Lots of people talk about knowledge graphs. Now, I deliberately decoupled the context of a knowledge graph from the data of a knowledge graph and separated those two things fundamentally because, and this is important, gravity. Data is heavy, metadata is light. And that's fundamentally why I've done this. Okay, So that turns out really valuable data is also highly asymmetrical. Again, a quote that I've now said. So today's AI challenge that we have in fundamentally realizing some of the value is that 85% of companies cannot get these things into production. Okay, this is a stat that we've sort of seen across the market, and some of these are our customers, and some of these are customers that we are getting engaged with to help them get things over the line. It turns out that there's a lot of reasons why. Cost drift, there's things around control over the model, IP ownership, fear of quality, the hallucination thing, data security, optionality and portability. So lots of new models. Every couple of weeks there's a new one. And remember, mostly it's because it's science. Science is slow. Science is experimental. Not everything's going to make it to production. And I think we have to learn to accept that. So we built the best model in the world for 2 weeks called DBRex. And we learned a lot of very interesting things about it. The most important thing we learned was that good data practices improve speed and efficiency of the model. We also learned around this idea of data quality and model mix. Now, why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because of this valuable data, this asymmetrical valuable data that people are not looking at to harness and squeeze out expertise. The idea of evaluation and measurement is an incredibly important one. We built a mixture of experts model, and that balances the model side with inference speeds. But there's some important reasons why all of these things and recipes are sort of coming together. So I'll give you a practical example. Like, remember I said that 20% of a CIO's budget is spent on maintaining code. We have a customer called Replit that literally have built a model that does code repair, and it's like a sort of accelerated copilot. They've built this despite not having tons and tons of repository data. It's a really fascinating way of thinking about waste disposal and removing waste. So how do we repair code, and how do we actually fix these things? So remember that thing I said about the red blood cells? Part of that's because we have these little things in our body that are able to repair DNA. A really interesting thing that I called out the last time, which was this idea that a small model could actually find the first antibiotic structure in nearly 60 years. Well, it turns out that this same group have continued, and they've done something quite remarkable. They've been able to find a model that is able to identify certain stages of breast cancer, and how that can likely progress to invasive cancer. So it's now becoming diagnostic tools. And these are the impact of these small models. And the impact is, can they actually fundamentally change how business capabilities run? And that's where we sort of see this move to compound AI systems, this idea of building AI applications that they have a degree of accuracy because they use a lot of deterministic pieces. We have expert systems in AI. That was the big thing in the 80s. Could we use that in combination with more of a probabilistic engine, so an LLM or a small language model? And then what's starting to happen is this breaking, repeating cycle. So this idea that brains and agents, and this tends to happen quite a bit. Anyway, I've hit you with a ton of information here in this expertise thing, but this is quite important, like fundamental stuff. And that the whole basis is, how do we think about decision and choice systems? Can we reimagine this? Can we reimagine strategic management? Can we reimagine decision scientists? How does this apply to organizational behavior? And that ultimately changes the way we have to think about strategy. So just as kind of key decisions on this is asking more questions of your business and clarifying that purpose, examining the fundamentals and clearing out the waste. So let's just jump very quickly into streamlining exchange. So can competitive dynamics, once we've evaluated this, get us fit for growth? So figuring out how to streamline so that we can grow faster. And we sort of see this internally. When we have accounts that are well maintained, they grow faster. When we have accounts that are a little bit under, they've got an accumulation of debt, they grow a lot slower. So their growth patterns are impacted. And we can actually analyze this stuff. And similarly, you're going to see this across the market. So let's ask these fundamental questions. What areas are we duplicating effort, and what is causing us to slow down? Now, what's fascinating is we've got the search tool at Databricks, which is built on Glean, and then we feed it with data. And we feed it with data from all sorts of different sources. So I can actually ask prompts like this, like who else is working on blah? And that fundamentally allows me to group people. I can group people based on missions that they happen to be working on, which is really fascinating. And because it outlines the material that they've produced and the different humans that are producing it. So I'm actually able to lineage those things back to who's contributing these pieces of material. Can't do everything yet, but it's actually quite a fascinating way. Most companies can't do organizational search. They can't ask these questions of their organization. And that's something that I think will change as companies start to realize they can unlock a lot of this data. Now, what's true is Conway's law is in existence and has been around for a long time. So this idea that organizations will always design systems as a copy of the organization. So the bigger your company, you know, Ronald Coase's whole thing about large firms, the more likely you are going to have lots of different silos. And how do you join those silos together? So appreciating that there's silos. So typically in the past, we used to call this integration. And the challenge in the AI race is integration does not mean interoperability. And this is a key thing. Like, how do you maintain the IP while still doing this sort of thing? Like, is a model the way to coalesce all these things? Or do I need building blocks that open and unlock these things? So let's think about this slightly differently, because this is what's going on the market. Everybody is closing the data taps, and they're predicting that this will cause an AI, the whole AI winter was changed into summer as a consequence of having access to all these available data sources. It's a really fascinating article that was produced recently. Today, the exchange is mostly file transfers in email. That's the reality, okay? And what's fascinating about that is we pay the price of data quality tax. So time, cost, energy, integrity. Like every time we have to check the quality of changing data, that is time, cost, energy, and integrity, okay? And what's funny is that ETL is an anti-pattern. It's actually something that has to be done because of proprietary storage. And it's in today's world, where we don't have scarcity of compute and storage, and we have open source in a prolific way, one has to ask the question, how important is ETL in the future? Obviously, there has to be an initial transform, but do we have to keep doing it? And that's sort of a question I'm asking, which is dangerous because 60% of our revenue as Databricks is ETL workloads. But I would love that in 6 years' time to be dropping because there's less ETL that's needed. So the best technology for solving complex problems is open source. And if you ever want to listen to somebody who's remarkable and has a lot of very interesting things to say, it's Bill Gurley. So we have open source this thing called Unity Catalog. And what's fascinating about that is if you think about what I said earlier, information, so the top of the screen, okay? So you got information here, you have models here, and you have unstructured data, so knowledge here. We have fundamentally recognized that you need to be able to catalog those three things to create true intelligence. And this is an open source format. It also supports other formats, you know, JSON and CSV and things like that. Now, if we put that into a stack form, what you have at the bottom is Parquet being the de facto standard for storage format of data. So it's become almost like the OS for data storage. In the middle, you've got Delta, Iceberg, and Hudi, and those are fundamentally becoming increasingly connected, and all of which are fundamentally connected by our Unity Catalog capability. We also have open source models, which are portable and interoperable. You have open source code, which is portable and interoperable. Now, the reason I've kind of articulated these blocks is because these blocks are the IP that one wants to keep. So ultimately, Databricks' value proposition is we make it really easy to use this stuff as a managed service, but it's the compute that we put our USP into. What's interesting is when you flip to the top, the connector ecosystem, and just how proprietary and noisy that space has become. So putting that into a different context, we've got this very strong coalescence at the bottom and a reasonable standardization taking place on open source. Databricks' value proposition is the data intelligence in the middle. And then as we move above, what we have is very locked in context semantics and skills. And anyone who's trying to figure out how do I get semantic consistency across my business, you've hit your head against a variety of different challenges, DAXs and ABAB, and there's lots of proprietary formats that come into play there, and there isn't a standardization, and it's a really, really interesting problem. There are some projects that have kicked off in the open source community to try and do that, but I think for me that's one of the biggest opportunity spaces in tech today is how do we open source and create an open standard to streamline this context and semantic layer. We sort of see why, being that data collaboration will drive better business impact. So lots of people talk about the data mesh. There's this idea of peer-to-peer sharing, third-party data sharing, this idea of clean room, privacy-safe collaboration, and then SaaS application sharing. SaaS application sharing is fundamental. We do not want our data locked into a SaaS application. So how do we create free flow? How do we create a reduction in transformation tax? So more and more, we as a global company, we see sort of run on the 3 hyperscaler clouds, and we see these gateways that we build on each cloud. And this is an example from a global company that has all 3 clouds, and each cloud plays a fundamentally different role and has fundamentally different domains. So some of them focus on manufacturing, some of them might focus on specific key capabilities around back office. Some of them might focus on R&D. And being able to bridge these and bring these together has been achievable using these kind of open source gateways and these compute engines and delta sharing as a capability. To give you a more practical example, imagine we have 3 domains within a company, and this is built off an actual practical example, and they have fundamentally different design principles. So you have a SaaS at the bottom, you have a sort of Imnon data warehouse at the top, and then you have this kind of data mesh, data product factory sort of on the left-hand side. The distribution of people is quite fascinating, where you have 150 people, 500 people, 2,000 people. And the relative headcount allocation and how people actually are doing similar things but in different domains is really challenging. So what we're starting to see is how Databricks is being used as a bridge, as this connected layer, and creating semantic consistency and the exchange of data products between these domains. So realizing Conway's law is real, but creating a kind of platform of platforms. And this happens, and this is a true story of how we've coalesced with some major players in the market. Some of them much harder to connect with. You have to use a gateway. Others are much easier because of their adoption of open source, and therefore you have this federation. And what that means from a human perspective is that you can reallocate those humans. So 2,000 people are now focused on AI, whereas the reduction and the harmonization has created a huge amount of streamlining in the production of data products, where you actually want to build on the creation of value off the back of it. This has also become a huge movement in the AI race because software engineers and full stack engineers, which represent a huger number, are starting to drift into that zone. And we're calling that the emergence of the AI engineer. And there's a really interesting group that have been profiling this called Latent Space. So what would you do with something like this? Well, I've used this example a few times, but if you examine the total cost of compliance, there's actually 5 questions that you ask. And those 5 questions, some are on the outside in, others on the inside out, and one's at the top going, are we compliant? And if you examine the cost, that's 10% of revenue for your average regulated company. Could we produce a compound AI system that focuses on connecting these different disparate sources of data? And how would we design those data sources in a different way to make them more interoperable and readable? So it's a fascinating way of thinking about org design through this interoperable transfer without having to do proprietary ETL tax. So one of the things I want to kind of call out is when you are thinking about duplication and how the impact that has on quality, are you thinking about that through the lens of time, cost, integrity, and energy, and evaluating how your company might need to be decluttered and connected in a different way? So let's jump into the kind of last piece. And this is quick because complex systems are really hard and I didn't want to break everyone's brain further than I already have. So how will we adapt our ecosystem? And this is a very, very interesting kind of question. So I was on the BBC recently, which was a really weird experience. And they asked me, what is the impact of AI projects on sustainability, which, to be honest, should be a question that every company's asked. So I've turned that into a prompt and I've recognized that the BBC asked the question. So while preparing for the interview, I started to think very carefully about it. And there's a piece of research that outlines that 80% of the global sustainability goals, because we tend to over-pivot sustainability equals energy. Actually, there's 17 goals and there's a lot of fundamentals that are necessary to be solved. And AI can be a major contributor to about 80% positively impacting how we solve these targets. Negatively, we have this sort of 35% that will be on the usage. That will be AI using a whole lot of different things. So that where I landed was, can we offset that by optimizing data? So deduplicate all the duplicate data that you have. How many ETLs do you have in your business that are doing exactly the same thing? You know, because they're in proprietary systems. They might even be in proprietary zombie systems. How much code do you have? The idea that 20% of your budget is maintaining code means you have too much code. It means you probably have a lot of duplicate code. It means you probably haven't got the most hygienic way of managing code. Metadata is something that's lighter and more interoperable. It's like 90% of our DNA is junk DNA. It's basically carryover metadata. You know, you can carry lots of metadata. You don't want to carry lots of data. Data's heavy, metadata's light. And models, the smaller the model, the lower the latency, the lower the inference. That actually isn't just a cost optimized way of thinking about it. It's also an energy optimized way of thinking about it. You know, if a model is smaller, it's using less energy to run. So there's a lot of ways we can start to think about offsets. And offsets create space for impact. So let's quickly, the customer story on this, Rolls-Royce, right? Predictive maintenance use case. Amazing story about how they looked at unlocking some legacy systems, how they did a huge amount of decluttering, how they did a predictive maintenance use case. The whole idea was to reduce the amount of unplanned airplane downtime, which every one of us who've ever flown, I fly a lot, these things are painful, they're annoying. But the true story here is the 22 million tons of carbon emissions that were saved. That's massive. And that's through a predictive maintenance use case that saved a human headache problem, but also solved and a big cost problem, but also was a great impacting result for the atmosphere. So what would happen if you got to more interoperable? So how many problems could you solve if you started to have cohesive connectivity between companies that was far more sustainable and far more efficient? And this is what our Delta sharing capability, that's open source, it's in the Linux Foundation, fundamentally is aiming to do. And there's a reason why this looks like a planet. So remember this statement: CIOs can spend 20% of their annual budget on maintaining code. Imagine I could harness some of the data from that code. So every time I speak to companies, they will say a lot of our expertise is locked in code. So what if we were able to create something that could translate that code? I call this corporate archaeology. So we've built some initial tools that can do this. It's a far more probabilistic way of translating old code. It's not ready for kind of full-blown migration processes, but we've actually got a bunch of recipes that we've started to build out and open source. one of my team will be calling this out very soon. It's a little project he's been working on, and I'm hoping that he does a webinar similar to this soon. So key takeaway on that last section is being wise about how you share all your data assets. So consolidating your data. How much duplicated data do you have, and is it still necessary? Cleaning your code. There was a clean code movement years ago that Uncle Bob kicked off. I think we need to get back to that. That hygiene of code actually makes cloud less expensive. Systematically and consistently, creating semantic consistent metadata, but being able to do that through the organization. And we have a whole bunch of projects kicking off where companies are looking to create semantically consistent metadata and using AI, and they're using kind of graphs and graph rags and really cool tools to do this. Smaller, portable, and owned models. So models that you own, where the IP is yours. You don't have to build them necessarily from scratch. There's a lot of very clever things you can do with fine-tuning nowadays. And lastly, what happens in these intersections? So we have three categories that are fascinating in terms of what is going to happen to them next. Intelligent automation, business process modeling, robotic process automation. These areas have already gone full-blown mature, but what happens to them in an AI-driven world? Integration and modern middleware. What happens to this layering? We're fundamentally seeing a difference of thinking in this space. And then business applications and the SaaS industry. Databricks has a huge number of businesses that have replatformed on us in the SaaS space. Companies like Adobe, Atlassian, Asana, they built on Databricks. And it's a really fascinating thing to see how they're changing the application architecture and what that change is looking at. And that's another project that we're investigating, is what is the application architecture change where this coalescence is happening between data and software engineering. And how does AI play a role there? And with that, I will stop presenting, and we can jump into questions.
Dael, I'm always left at the end of your sessions going, I surely wish that I wasn't thrown immediately into a live Q&A session with you, because I feel like I need to go back to the recording and chunk it into little sections where I can go, just think about that for a while, because that was an incredible concept. And then it was hit by another one and another one and another one after that. I hope I'm not the only one in the audience that's a little bit overawed by everything that you present, but certainly fascinating and incredibly stimulating stuff to start thinking about in terms of where this is. And while our audience is perhaps gathering their thoughts and about to pose a couple of questions to you, I did make a couple of notes along the way, and I hope you don't mind if I jump in quickly with just one or two questions. And there was an interesting bit in there, and I will come back to the tech, because I'm fully aware that most of the people here love the tech, but you made a statement in there that people are bigger than their roles. And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind just commenting on that dimension of things in terms of the people element alongside this technology and the implementation of AI.
I'm basically poaching the commentary from Simon Sinek, and he said some fascinating things about the asymmetry of humans and the very strong fit that people have in the role that they play in the company. And one of the key areas that he sort of drives is that humans, really talented people, are sort of highly asymmetrical. And the question that you have to ask yourself, because I like this idea of now pushing things to questions, is have you ever tried to fit somebody into a role you've defined beforehand? And the flip to that is you're better off designing a role around who they are versus what role can I fit you into? Because talented people don't fit into a factory. They're artists who produce amazing work, and they also produce flops. You kind of kill their potential by fitting them into a box. And you then sideline them when they fail. And this is the management tolerance of highly talented people. And it's why talented people leave organizations and move on to other organizations. And it's funny because there's an analogy to this that Simon Sinek used. He talked about constraints versus budgets. And budgets are actually very anti-creative. You constrain too much. Job descriptions are anti-creative.
Indeed. I think the connection I was looking at from that statement was going, if in making a statement like that people are bigger than these roles, Databricks and the advanced thinkers like yourselves are creating this ecosystem where the silos have been removed. The opportunity to now pose questions against this is just a brand new footing for people within these organizations that are tasked with some of the longest lasting questions that have prevailed against business. How do we forecast ourselves into the future? How do we position ourselves sustainably? All of those complex pieces. And you were pointing towards the new roles and requirements of those people, which is why that bit of people are more than their roles and are asymmetric in terms of their talents and abilities really stuck with me. And again, I think it's one of those bits that I'm always interested in asking somebody like you to go, okay, so for the people on this call and anybody that might watch the recording, what's the gap in our thinking at the moment between what we've experienced and what we're used to doing with these things versus the capability that's coming out now that we should be thinking about and going, how do I get the value out of that? How do I approach it in the right way? What am I missing from a skills point of view or thinking point of view from myself in order to actually work with this?
So I think it's got to do with some of the comments I made about the silos, right? So we kind of created domain constructs, bounded contexts that humans fit into. Okay, I mean the job will fit into this bounded context, and those bounded contexts are very old. They are based on lots of different prevailing factors. You know, at the top, it could be management theory. It could be like a lot of ways in which we always thought about running organizations. At the bottom, it could be, you know, constraint of compute and storage that led to proprietary types of technologies. You know, it could be like you sit in your box and your box does this job. Okay. With us breaking boundaries between these different domains, and I was actually having this conversation with a chief data officer of a major bank recently, what happens to the domains as they change? And that's where the asymmetry of humans becomes really, really interesting. Because as the bounded contexts shift to be more maybe value stream led than very box in a box in a box capability led, you know, you have a functional role in a broader capability, and you don't actually see the bigger picture. If people fit more into how things actually flow, like product creation to activation, like what does that change in domain construct look like, and how would an asymmetrical person redefine themselves in that new world? I think that's where the opportunity comes for people, is you don't have to be cast into a traditional role box. Like let's take a common role, like take the solution architect. Like there are very variable definitions of that role. So on the vendor side, we have a definition. On the customer side, we have a definition. And in the consulting side, we have a definition. And they're very, very different. How do we reframe that to actually solve higher order problems? So being more question centric, you know, some of those existential questions I pointed out, and kind of moving them down a little bit, because there's micro versions and macro versions. We don't have to start with the macro versions. We can actually, sometimes macro is not a bad place to start when you're reevaluating. But that's sort of more the framing. And the thing is, because there's been this whole shuffle, standardization of open source, but also big disruption because of AI, we have a chance to re-examine the technical pieces and reorder them. And I think one of the most fascinating roles that's going to have to rethink themselves is enterprise architects and business architects, because I think those two have a real harness on the fundamentals, but are the pieces in the right order? Has enough change happened that there has to be a kind of re-examination? And I don't think anyone's really truly thinking like that through. And there are people that are doing it, but they're startups and they're new and emerging, and they basically have no baggage.
So the business schools might be just a little bit behind in terms of what they're presenting from organizational design and business architecture.
I think so. And you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's good stuff in there. Like, even if you kind of examine the catalog of TOGAF, there's some very, very cool stuff in there. How it's put together into a formula is really verbose. So like, there's lots of people who have been kind of ruminating with how do you re-examine these things. I think that there's a giant decluttering that needs to take place. Like, we're in mass migration mode, but we don't have to just move things from A to B. We can recast them in a different format, and then test some things out. And I think there's enough thinking around what that format could be on like day one, without us having to go into full-blown analysis paralysis. And that's why I was examining these AI driven companies, because to be 3 trillion market cap with 26,000 people and being asset light is a kind of remarkable examination. And none of that, and they're a tech company. So they're not producing software, they're actually producing hardware, which is even more fascinating.
Amazing. Dael, I'm aware that we're running short on time, and probably, again, selfishly, I've still got a couple of questions that hopefully are ones that are on the minds of our audience as well. From what you've presented, Databricks and the organization that you represent is doing an amazing job at effectively creating this unified ecosystem with the potential to leverage the data into information, into knowledge, into models is really coming to bear very quickly. I wonder, though, what your view is on how Databricks and you very smart people are going to solve that semantic layer problem.
I think we're going to solve it exactly the same way that we've solved other layers of the stack. So innovation coupled with community and the power of open source will be the best way of kind of solving for that. As we move into that sort of layer of the stack, there's an examination that has to take place of like, what works and what doesn't. You don't want to kind of always be reinventing the wheel. We don't always, rebuild from scratch. I think how the change happens and the value that sits in that layer, the value that sits in that layer fundamentally runs, traffic systems and runs air traffic control. It makes ships go from A to B. You can't disrupt that too easily. It's something that's going to take an ecosystem. It's going to take a standardization. But I think it's the most difficult layer to solve because of some of the things I mentioned, which was language. Now, the cool thing about language models is they give us a real power of like how to manipulate language. So that's why I think that there's an inflection point. But I do believe, solving a complex problem, like Bill Gurley said, it will be done through open source and open standards. So right now we're examining how there's baby steps, right? So we've introduced a kind of metrics layer into UC called UC metrics. In parallel, the SQL community are introducing in ANSI SQL a measures layer. both of those two things are quite similar to each other in terms of the kind of problems that they're solving. And it's trying to remove some of that embedded logic and put it into the open source layers. As we move up the stack, we'll start to move into how do we decouple the heavy stuff from like, OWL and, RDF and labeled property graphs and some of those other semantic contexts. There's a lot of semantic layer companies who are thinking about open sourcing their IP, and that's remarkable. And I would encourage more companies to sort of open source what they've got. Goldman Sachs actually open sourced a kind of piece called Legend from their capabilities, and they put it into the Finos community. You've got companies like Shell that are open sourcing a lot of their semantic pieces, and being the donator of that is a really powerful thing. So I think we don't necessarily need to be the ones that do the donation. We would love to work with companies that want to donate that sort of IP and actually build a community off it. Because like you're seeing with Mark Zuckerberg, like with Llama, he's open sourcing the models because it creates a community around his architecture. It's a fascinating way of driving a market in a fundamentally different form. And it makes him sticky. So it's different. It's not lock-in in the traditional sense.
Real communities brought to bear on artificial intelligence and capabilities, yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Dael, perhaps a last thing to ask is, again, for the audience that is here and hearing about interoperability and the unification across the ecosystem and what's there, how do they make a start with their own organizations, of going back to the organization and going, this is where we are and this is where we need to be? What would be your advice to them to go start with looking at this?
I get asked this quite often, and actually one of the best places to start is to do a reasonably heavy audit of your service catalog. You have a whole, like, who are the companies we're paying money to, and how do I audit this in a fundamentally different way? Like, I've got to kind of look through whether the zombie thing is just something I found quite entertaining. Like, how many of the companies that I pay money to will not have a future in 5 years? That's organizational risk. How many of the technologies that I'm using today have no resource? Like, there are no skills on the market. How many of the companies that are fundamentally sort of sitting in that service catalog are holding my data hostage, or there is a lot of IP that is locked away in there? And it's not to say you have to kill it all. It's to say, if you're going to do a bit of decluttering, do a bit of a serious stock take of where the value sits and how you identify that. But you have to identify it in a way where don't just think about the data as the valuable pieces. Metadata is incredibly valuable. The business logic's incredibly valuable. The code is incredibly valuable. All of that is sort of IP that's collected over time. And the question is, how do you take that into one of those kind of more broader multipliers? The 10x multipliers, what a digital platform has, the software multipliers, what a software company has. That's really valuable stuff. And you got to think very carefully about how you mine it.
Dael Williamson, EMEA CTO for Databricks, thank you so much for yet another incredible presentation and the deep insights you have shared. Dael, we love having you. We would welcome you back again, obviously in the near future when you have time. But just on behalf of the audience and myself, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Awesome. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thanks again for giving me a space to talk.